He was not born into He was not born into money, he was born into movement. Charles E. Merrill's childhood was one of small towns, shifting jobs, and endless lessons about what it meant to want more. His father was a physician who never quite found comfort. His mother, a teacher who believed ambition could save a man. From them, Merrill inherited a strange combination of empathy and hunger, the two forces that would define his life. At the turn of the 20th century, America was still a young giant stretching its limbs. Railroads were arteries, factories were lungs. Money flowed like blood, but only through certain veins. The ordinary worker might touch it once a week, payday, and then it was gone again. Merrill arrived in New York at 24, lean, curious, and armed with nothing but arithmetic and a belief that the world was changing faster than the people who owned it. Wall Street at that time was not the glittering canyon we imagine today. It was a cramped, noisy street of telegraph wires, clerks with ink-stained cuffs, and runners shouting quotes from the curb. Deals were made in smoke-filled rooms where the word gentleman meant insider. Merrill began as a messenger. He watched, listened, memorized faces. He understood quickly that success was not about risk, but rhythm, the tempo of confidence and fear that made markets breathe. The men who mastered it looked like magicians. The ones who missed a beat vanished overnight. While most newcomers chased rumors, Merrill studied people. He saw the divide between the public and the market, a canyon of misunderstanding. Ordinary Americans viewed the stock exchange the way they viewed a volcano, powerful, unpredictable, best observed from a distance. Merrill thought differently. He believed the market could be tamed, translated, even humanized. He spent nights writing notes in the margins of newspapers. What if, he scribbled once, finance could be explained in plain English? He imagined a storefront where sunlight poured in instead of cigar smoke, where the word broker didn't sound like a warning. By 1914, with a small amount of savings and a partner, Edmund Lynch, he opened his own firm. The sign outside read simply, Merrill, Lynch and Company. The name carried no prestige yet, but it sounded honest. Two men standing together. Their first office had a single telephone and a clock that ran 3 minutes fast. Merrill insisted on it. He told his clerks, if we're early, we're prepared. If we're late, we're forgotten. The early years were lean. Clients were cautious. The First World War was raging across the Atlantic, and Wall Street shuddered at every headline. Yet Merrill found opportunity in uncertainty. He realized that chaos was when trust mattered most. He began publishing small pamphlets explaining what his firm was doing and why. They weren't filled with jargon or grand promises, just sentences people could understand. Your savings are your future, one began. Treat them as you would your home, with care, not fear. This was radical. No one spoke to the public that way. Finance had always relied on mystery. Merrill relied on clarity. He wanted people to believe that investing wasn't gambling, it was participation. Slowly, it worked. Small investors trickled in. A teacher with $200, a shopkeeper who wanted to put aside something for his daughter's education. Merrill greeted them personally. He taught his employees to do the same. We don't sell stock, he said. We sell confidence. Then came the 1920s, the decade when America decided the future had already arrived. Jazz, automobiles, neon, skyscrapers. The energy was intoxicating. People believed in progress the way their grandparents had believed in God. Merrill believed too, but differently. To him, prosperity was not a storm to ride, but a structure to build. He warned his brokers never to treat clients as marks. Our business is not to take their money, he told them. It is to keep their trust so they bring their children. He built his offices to look like banks. Marble floors, polished brass rails, clean counters. He made investing feel respectable, safe, almost domestic. Newspapers began calling him the people's broker. He didn't like the title, but he didn't reject it either. As his influence grew, Merrill began to see finance as part of democracy itself. If men and women can vote, he said once, they should also have a stake in the system their votes protect. He pushed for public education about money, arguing that ignorance was the root of inequality. His ideas spread. Other firms copied his model. The line between Main Street and Wall Street began to blur. For the first time, millions of Americans saw the stock market not as a casino, but as a ladder. By the middle of the decade, Merrill's offices stretched from coast to coast. Clerks worked late under the glow of green desk lamps, transcribing quotes, sending telegrams, reassuring clients that the boom would continue. The sound of the ticker tape became the heartbeat of the nation. Yet Merrill sensed the rhythm changing. Beneath the music of prosperity, he heard a faint dissonance, the whisper of excess. Credit was spreading like perfume, irresistible, invisible, intoxicating. People bought cars on credit, homes on credit, even stocks on credit. Brokers offered margin accounts, allowing clients to invest borrowed money. The idea was simple. If the market keeps rising, everyone wins. Merrill knew better. He kept careful ledgers, watching ratios that few others noticed. The numbers frightened him. Debts were climbing faster than incomes. Companies were overvalued, fueled by speculation rather than production. He tried to warn his peers, but no one wanted to listen to caution while champagne flowed. In private, he told his wife, "We are selling too much hope and not enough truth." By 1928, Merrill's worry turned to conviction. He began quietly instructing his firm to tighten credit, to sell risky positions, to hold cash. Many of his partners protested. They said he was betraying the boom that had made them rich. Merrill replied, "Better a smaller fortune that lasts than a large one that vanishes." In September 1929, the whisper became a roar. Prices began to falter. Then panic set in. On a gray morning in October, the market crashed. In a single week, years of illusion evaporated. Men who had borrowed to invest lost everything. Banks failed. Factories closed. The ticker tape machines fell silent. Their endless chatter replaced by a sound more terrible, the stillness of disbelief. Merrill's firm survived, but barely. He had avoided the worst through caution, yet the sight of ruin around him left a mark deeper than any loss. He walked through the financial district and saw faces pressed against locked bank doors. People had trusted the system, his system, and now they were broken by it. He told his partners, "We built a house for the people and forgot to make the foundation strong." That realization changed him forever. As the 1930s dawned and the Great Depression deepened, Merrill withdrew from the spotlight. He closed offices, restructured debt, and refused to trade on despair. He spent his time reading letters from former clients, some angry, some pleading, some simply lost. He kept them in a drawer labeled Reminders. Out of that darkness came his new purpose, to rebuild faith, not fortunes. He began sketching plans for what he called a citizen's market, a place where transparency and education would replace speculation. He told a journalist, "If the market is to serve the people, then the people must first understand it." This would become his crusade. He hired teachers to train his brokers. He demanded that every report be written in plain language. He insisted that the first thing a client should receive was not a pitch, but a pamphlet explaining risk. He ordered that his offices include classrooms, blackboards, and open seminars. The press mocked him. Competitors laughed. They said, "You can't turn Wall Street into Sunday school." But Merrill didn't care. He had seen what ignorance could destroy. He wanted a future where even a factory worker could look at a balance sheet and see not confusion, but clarity. By 1939, as the world edged again toward war, Merrill's vision began to bear fruit. Ordinary Americans started returning to the market, cautiously, deliberately. They trusted his firm because it treated them as students, not gamblers. When the decade closed, Merrill Lynch had become more than a company. It was a philosophy, yet the belief that finance could be moral, that wealth could be shared responsibly. He would later say, "We did not rebuild the market. We rebuilt confidence." And in those words lay the seed of everything that came after, the rise of post-war prosperity, the birth of consumer credit, and the long, complicated story of how a dream of equality became a system of endless appetite. When the guns of World War II fell silent, America exhaled. The fear and rationing, the uncertainty and sacrifice, all of it gave way to something radiant. A country that had learned discipline in hardship now discovered abundance in peace. The soldiers who returned weren't kings or conquerors. They were builders. They wanted homes, jobs, and stability. And for the first time in modern history, the world's most powerful nation could actually give them that. Factories that had once produced bombers and tanks now made cars, refrigerators, and radios. The hum of industry became the new national anthem. Suburbs bloomed like spring after a long winter. The word ownership became synonymous with freedom itself. Charles Merrill saw this transformation and smiled quietly. He had spent the dark years of the Depression trying to remind Americans that money was a servant, not a master. Now they were listening. His firm, reborn as Merrill, Lynch, Pierce, Fenner, and Bean, had survived the hardest test a financial institution could face: moral resurrection. But Merrill understood that prosperity was not self-sustaining. It had to be taught, managed, and occasionally restrained. The optimism of the new era was immense, but so was its naivety. His firm's advertisements didn't promise riches, they promised understanding. One read, "The right to be informed is as American as the right to vote." That line became a quiet revolution. Merrill Lynch opened branches in towns that had never seen a stockbroker. They printed booklets explaining what bonds were, how dividends worked, and why patience was the investor's greatest ally. Families who had once hidden cash under mattresses now discussed portfolios at the dinner table. Wall Street had moved to Main Street, and Merrill had built the bridge. Yet behind that triumph lay an irony even he didn't foresee. The more people understood money, the more they wanted it to move faster. The 1950s were a decade of simplicity on the surface. Gray suits, white fences, black coffee. But beneath that order pulsed a new rhythm of desire. Credit, once a rare privilege, became an instrument of progress. If you couldn't afford it now, the bank would help you. The word installment replaced someday. At first, this felt harmless. A refrigerator today, a television tomorrow. What was the harm in borrowing from the future if the future looked so bright? Merrill watched it happen with both admiration and unease. His firm helped underwrite loans, bonds, and mortgages that fueled this boom. The American dream had never seemed so accessible, but the foundation of that dream was shifting, from savings to spending, from patience to immediacy. The new investor was not just a shareholder, he was a consumer, and in the consumer, a new kind of power and fragility was born. Merrill was aging now. The young brokers called him the professor. Behind his back, half in respect, half in awe. He spoke less, but when he did, people listened. In board meetings, he warned about the intoxication of easy money. "Every system we build," he said once, "must carry the seed of its correction." But in the booming glow of post-war America, correction was the last thing anyone wanted to hear. The country's wealth was expanding faster than imagination. Wall Street was flush with liquidity, and the middle class was becoming the engine of everything. Corporations began advertising shares directly to the public. Glossy brochures showed happy families holding stock certificates like diplomas of success. Merrill Lynch was everywhere: radio shows, newspapers, even public schools. It wasn't just a company anymore. It was a national institution of belief. And Charles Merrill had become its philosopher. He wrote essays about ethics in business, insisting that capitalism without conscience was simply a machine waiting to break. He donated to schools, funded financial literacy programs, and insisted that his firm's offices maintain the same code: candor above commission. He was trying to build an antidote to greed, a moral infrastructure to protect people from the system's own appetite. But progress moves faster than principle. By the late 1950s, new players were entering the game. Credit cards appeared, a small piece of plastic that would quietly reshape human behavior. Banks realized that lending wasn't just a service, it was an industry. Advertisers discovered that desire could be manufactured. The golden age of post-war America, for all its optimism, was built on the subtle promise that tomorrow would always pay for today. Merrill, already in fragile health, watched this evolution with mixed feelings. He was proud of what he had built, proud that millions of Americans now felt confident about their financial future. But he also saw a dangerous symmetry forming between hope and debt. He confided to a colleague, "We gave them tools to build wealth. Now everyone is building ladders, but few are checking how high they go." He knew his time was limited. Illness slowed him, but his mind remained sharp. In his final years, he spent hours alone in his office, reviewing letters from clients who thanked him for helping them send children to college, buy homes, or start businesses. He read them slowly, like prayers. He had changed lives. There was no denying that. Yet sometimes he wondered whether he had also changed expectations in ways that could never be undone. He once wrote in an unpublished memo, "When wealth becomes ordinary, risk becomes invisible." He passed away in 1956 quietly, surrounded by family. Newspapers mourned him as the man who taught America to invest. His funeral was attended by politicians, financiers, and clerks who had once fetched coffee in his offices. To most, his legacy was clear. He had democratized finance. He had turned saving into strategy and investment into identity. But history, as always, has its second draft. The seeds Merrill planted continued to grow long after he was gone. In the decades that followed, America's relationship with money deepened and darkened. The generation he had empowered became the first to live entirely within the system he built. They borrowed for homes, for cars, for college, for comfort. Each purchase felt like progress. Each debt felt like participation. And beneath that optimism, a new truth began to take root, that freedom itself was now financed. The nation had learned to believe in credit as a form of faith. The banker had taught them how to dream responsibly, and they had turned that responsibility into routine. But what began as dignity through ownership would, in time, become something heavier. That story, the transformation of hope into liability, of security into dependence, would define the century Merrill never lived to see. He had built the architecture of trust. Others would build the machines of profit inside it. The world he left behind gleamed with prosperity, but it was already quietly mortgaging the future. By the 1960s, the world Charles Merrill had imagined, a world of balance and education, was already drifting into something else. America had become the richest nation on earth. Its corporations were global, its currency the benchmark of value, its citizens the envy of the planet. But prosperity, once shared, was beginning to stratify. The grandchildren of the Depression no longer feared losing everything. They feared not having enough of everything. Television became the new oracle of the American dream. In glowing commercials, banks and brokerage firms promised not just safety or growth, but identity. The home, the car, the college degree, each was an emblem of arrival, and each was available for the right payment plan. Wall Street, once a network of human relationships, began to mechanize. Computers appeared, slow, massive, room-sized creatures that could process more trades in an hour than a clerk could in a week. Numbers became the new gods. Merrill Lynch, now the largest brokerage in the world, carried his name like a banner of trust. But even within its marble walls, something had changed. The ethos of service was competing with the culture of speed. Young analysts no longer memorized client birthdays, they memorized metrics. The old slogan, "Candor above commission," still hung in the offices, but it had become more memory than mantra. In 1971, the United States abandoned the gold standard. For the first time, the dollar was no longer tied to metal, only to faith. It was the perfect metaphor for the age. Wealth as belief, credit as currency. The market roared again, not with the steady hum of production, but the chaotic pulse of speculation. Mutual funds, derivatives, options, new instruments with beautiful names and invisible risks. The financial world was inventing ways to make money out of motion itself, and America followed. Middle-class families invested their pensions in funds they didn't understand. Companies restructured, merged, and multiplied. Debt was no longer a symptom, it was strategy. The post-war dream of stability was morphing into a doctrine of growth at any cost. Charles Merrill's ghost seemed to linger in the background of every glossy advertisement. His image appeared in company brochures beside smiling couples. His words about education and trust were quoted in annual reports by executives who had never met a factory worker in their lives. The myth of the people's broker had become a marketing tool. He had built a bridge between Wall Street and Main Street. Now, traffic ran both ways, and the tolls were higher than ever. Through the 1970s, a series of crises began to crack the illusion. The oil shock of 1973 sent inflation soaring. Savings accounts, the very heart of Merrill's philosophy, became liabilities as prices outpaced interest. The average American family watched the value of their paychecks shrink month by month, but the response was not restraint. It was reinvention. The Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker squeezed inflation by raising interest rates to painful heights. Businesses adapted. Banks innovated. If cash lost value, then the solution was leverage. And so, the 1980s were born, an era of ambition dressed as freedom. Wall Street returned to the center of the American story, not as teacher or guardian, but as stage. Stockbrokers were celebrities now, young, brash, ambitious. They didn't speak of prudence or patience. They spoke of moves and plays. The old image of the gray-haired advisor was replaced by the yuppie in a pinstripe suit holding a cellular phone the size of a brick. Merrill Lynch rode the wave along with everyone else, its offices filled with terminals and ticker screens. The sound of typewriters gave way to the hum of computers and the shout of traders. Profit replaced purpose as the daily measure of success. The irony was painful. The very firm founded on the idea of protecting the small investor had become one of the engines of speculative capitalism. The world Merrill dreamed of, the informed citizen, the educated investor, was giving way to a new archetype, the addicted one. Credit cards multiplied, home equity loans exploded. Americans weren't just buying stocks, they were mortgaging their lives to finance lifestyles. The difference between wealth and debt became cosmetic. If you could make the payments, you were winning. By the mid 1980s, financial innovation had outpaced financial wisdom. Junk bonds, leveraged buyouts, speculative real estate trusts, the vocabulary of greed had gone mainstream. Television glorified it, magazines glamorized it, movies like Wall Street turned the once humble broker into an anti hero, a cultural archetype of ambition without apology. Somewhere in all of this, the line between creation and consumption blurred beyond recognition. Money no longer represented value, it represented velocity. The faster it moved, the richer everyone appeared to be. But beneath the glitter of skyscrapers and the flash of champagne glasses, another story was unfolding. Quieter, slower, but more permanent. Ordinary Americans, the very people Merrill had wanted to empower, were sinking into an invisible dependency. Mortgages stretched to 30 years. Credit cards carried interest rates that quietly devoured paychecks. Education, once the great equalizer, became a loan instead of a ladder. And through it all, the language of optimism persisted. Commercials spoke of financial freedom, not financial fragility. Banks promised empowerment even as they lengthened the chains of obligation. In the halls of power, deregulation was celebrated as progress. The old barriers that had once kept banks, brokers, and insurers separate were dismantled in the name of efficiency. The same word, freedom, was used to describe both democracy and debt. Charles Merrill's vision of moral capitalism had evolved into something else, something more efficient, more seductive, and far less human. He had wanted people to understand finance. Instead, finance had learned how to understand people, how to study, predict, and profit from every choice they made. The system that once served the citizen had quietly made the citizen its fuel. And yet, even in this transformation, the echo of his original promise remained. Every time a family bought their first home, every time a worker invested in a pension, every time someone felt a flicker of pride signing a document that said owner, they were touching his legacy. The dream had not died, it had just been monetized. By the end of the 1980s, America had entered an age of paradox, richer than ever, and more indebted than ever. Merrill Lynch was a global powerhouse, managing billions. Its executives flew on private jets to conferences where they quoted the company's founder and toasted the people's prosperity. But for millions of citizens, prosperity had become a balancing act between paychecks and payments, hope and interest. The foundation that Charles Merrill had poured, education, trust, participation, still held the structure upright. But above it, a new architecture had risen, made not of marble, but of mirrors. The markets glowed with artificial light. The world watched in fascination. And the machine kept running. The 1990s opened like a curtain on a stage already set. The Cold War had ended. The internet was emerging, and America once again stood at the center of its own narrative. Confident, prosperous, untouchable. But this time, prosperity wasn't made in factories or found in oil fields. It was made in data. The ticker tape had become pixels, the stock certificate a line of code. Charles Merrill had once dreamed of giving ordinary people access to the market. Now, his dream had gone digital. Online brokerages were springing up, promising that anyone with a computer could trade from their living room. The tools of Wall Street, once guarded by professionals, were now available to everyone. It was the purest realization of Merrill's idea, financial democracy at the speed of a click. But there was something different in the air, a kind of restlessness that even Merrill's moral optimism could never have predicted. In the old days, investing had been about patience. Dividends took time. Companies grew like trees. In the new age, investing was a form of entertainment. Charts danced in real time. Fortune could be made or lost before breakfast. People no longer came to the market seeking stability. They came for sensation. The brokers of the 1990s weren't teachers. They were salesmen in cyberspace. And the students weren't learners. They were gamblers in disguise. The dot-com boom was a fever dream. Every new company, no matter how absurd its business model, was a ticket to imagined wealth. Websites that sold nothing but ideas were valued higher than manufacturers employing thousands. The mantra was simple: the future will justify everything. And then, just as in 1929, it didn't. When the bubble burst in 2000, the losses were staggering. But unlike the crash of Merrill's era, there were no breadlines this time. Only digital heartbreak. People didn't lose farms or factories, they lost belief. Yet once again, America did what it always does. It reinvented the illusion. A few years later, housing became the new frontier. Banks, flush with data and confidence, began lending to anyone with a pulse. Mortgages were packaged, repackaged, and sold around the world as safe investments. Families who once dreamed of owning a home now found themselves owning 10 times their income in debt. This was not Merrill's America anymore. It was his dream turned inside out. Where he had tried to bring education to the masses, corporations brought temptation. Where he had taught prudence, the system now taught participation without understanding. The new creed was simple. If everyone borrows, everyone benefits. But debt, like gravity, always wins in the end. The collapse of 2008 revealed the full shape of the modern world, a world built on Merrill's foundation of trust, but hollowed by speculation. The same words he had once used, stability, participation, access, were used by the architects of the crisis to justify the very instruments that caused it. When the markets fell, the echo of 1929 returned, not as tragedy, but as pattern. The government intervened. The banks were saved, and the ordinary people, the workers, the teachers, the families who believed in the system were told, once again, to trust it. In the ruins of that decade, something new emerged: cynicism. The American dream no longer felt like a promise, it felt like a payment plan. And yet, the rhythm of belief continued. By the 2010s, technology had turned finance into culture. Phones became trading floors. Apps turned speculation into a game. Charles Merrill's dream of an open market had finally become universal and unstoppable. Everyone could invest. Everyone could lose. Everyone could participate in the great algorithmic carnival of modern capitalism. But if Merrill could have seen it, he might have recognized the old irony, that freedom without wisdom is just another form of dependence. The system he built to humanize money had become a system that monetized humanity. Every click, every purchase, every heartbeat measured, predicted, and priced. The banker who sold hope had built the scaffolding for a world where hope itself became the product. And yet, it would be wrong to see him only as the cause of it all. Merrill was not a villain. He was a mirror. He reflected what people wanted: dignity, fairness, participation, and gave it to them in the only form the modern world could understand: finance. He believed that understanding could make people free. He believed that transparency could replace fear, and in many ways, he was right. Millions of families still invest wisely. Millions still retire with comfort, still educate their children, still find security in the system he helped design. But the difference between his time and ours is subtle and profound. For Merrill, the market was a tool. For us, it has become the world itself. In his age, people dreamed of money so they could live better lives. In ours, people live their lives so they can earn, trade, and borrow money. He saw finance as a bridge between ambition and reality. We have turned it into a theater of constant motion. And so, his legacy endures, not as a monument, but as an atmosphere. We breathe it every day when we swipe a card, check a balance, or measure our worth in numbers on a screen. We live, as one writer put it, in Merrill's empire of faith. A faith not in God or gold or nation, but in the continuity of credit. It's hard to say what Charles Merrill would think of this. Perhaps he would marvel at the reach of his vision, the universality of finance, the sophistication of systems, the elegance of numbers. Or perhaps he would feel the same quiet fear he felt in 1929, that we have mistaken access for understanding and motion for meaning. The truth is, his dream worked. It worked so well that it became invisible. We no longer question the idea that prosperity is possible for all, even when the math says otherwise. Every generation since him has lived inside the architecture of belief he built. The belief that knowledge can conquer risk, that participation equals fairness, that markets, like people, always correct themselves. And so we continue buying, borrowing, investing, refinancing, the endless cycle of hope and repayment that defines modern civilization. It is tempting to say that Charles Merrill gave us capitalism, but that's not quite true. He gave us something older, deeper, the belief that order could be drawn from chaos, that trust could be manufactured, that a dream could be shared. He sold hope, and he meant every word of it. The tragedy and the triumph of his story is that hope, once distributed, cannot be controlled. It evolves, it compounds, it becomes the air we breathe. Today, when you walk through the canyons of Wall Street or scroll through a stock trading app on your phone, you are seeing the final expression of that century-old experiment. A world in which every citizen is both investor and investment. Charles E. Merrill didn't just democratize money, he democratized meaning. And in doing so, he changed not just how we earn, but how we believe. He never imagined the skyscrapers, the satellites, the glowing screens that would carry his idea into every hand. He never saw the debt crisis, the digital coins, the endless market tickers pulsing through the night, but he would have recognized the emotion behind it all. That same yearning he saw in the eyes of the teacher with $200, the factory worker buying his first share, the family saving for a future they couldn't yet see. It was never about numbers. It was about belonging. And that is the irony at the heart of his legacy. That in trying to make wealth human, Charles Merrill helped make humanity financial. He built a bridge, and we turned it into a highway. A century later, the traffic still flows. Some are heading toward freedom, some toward ruin. Most simply are trying to keep moving. Because the dream still works, just not always for the dreamer. And maybe that is how every empire ends. Not in collapse, but in continuation. Not in silence, but in the soft, constant hum of belief.